Good evening. Tonight's language is English, but I guess questions and conversation can be, of course, also in German. I'm Ekaterina Degot. I'm the director and artistic and chief curator of steirischer Herbst Festival. This is our palace, but it doesn't all belong to us. This is not our rooms are more shabby, but still, this is the good part of being in Graz. There are lots of palaces around. So I'm very glad to greet you all here, as if we are the festival, but we still have also a university collaboration. And we are very glad that today it's our first attempt at university collaboration, which also has audience. And I see some members of the audience here. I'm very glad to see you here. ESM is an abbreviation for Educating, Curating, Managing, ECM, sorry, Educating, Curating, Managing at the Angewandte, which has just recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. And I'm very glad to greet here both Nora Sternfeld and Beatrice Jaschke, who are co-directors of the master's program. And they have been doing a very successful discourse program called ECM Discourse. And I'm also very glad to welcome Oliver Marchart, who will be one of the speakers tonight. And I'm welcoming also all of the students who are joining us tonight from Vienna and have a busy weekend ahead. Or behind them, seeing and visiting other museums and institutions, and of course also all our guests. And I also want to express my gratitude to the team of steirischer Herbst who worked on that, and especially to Barbara Zarel, our researcher and university program coordinator, who did lots and lots of work for this project. And I'm giving the word to her now.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers for tonight. So the event was actually communicated to have as a guest also Vít Havranek, but he couldn't join us today because he had to cancel because he's sick. So I'm really happy to introduce Oliver Marchart, who really spontaneously agreed to come to Graz. So Oliver is a professor of political theory at the University of Vienna, at the Institute for Political Sciences. He focuses on political theory, social theory, democracy theory, among other topics. And in 2008, he published the book Hegemonie im Kunstfeld, die Dokumente-Ausstellungen D10, D11, D12 und die Politik der Biennalisierung. And also in 2019, his book, Conflictual Aesthetics, Artistic Activism and the Public Sphere, which is about the radical potential that public art curators and biennales hold. So thank you, Oliver, for joining us. Then we have Nora Sternfeld, who together with Beatrice Jaschke is co-director of the ECM. As we heard, it's Educating, Curating, Managing. She's also professor of art education at the HFBK Hamburg and is core team of Schnittpunkt and also co-founder and partner of Trafuka. She was one of the artistic directors of the Bergen Assembly in 2016, and in 2018 she published, among other publications of course, Das Radikaldemokratische Museum. Lastly, but not least, we have Ekaterina Degot, who has been artistic director, head curator of steirischer Herbst since 2018. And from 2014 to 2017, she was artistic director of the Academy of the Arts of the World in Cologne. She also curated the first Ural Industrial Biennial in Yekaterinburg in 2010, together with Cosmin Kostinas and David Riff, and she headed the first Bergen Assembly with David Riff in 2013. So thank you to the speakers and enjoy the evening.
Thanks. Thank you very much for hosting us here, and thank you for this possibility to think together about what the function of biennials and festivals could be today, or in other words, what they could do. We wanted to think about biennials and festivals in the context, of course, of very specific economic and discursive conditions in which we live in, and I will just quickly speak about them, but this doesn't mean anything, or it's not enough if we don't think at the same time about what is to be done, what can be done in this very specific context. We wanted to do that very generously, of course, in the context of this beautiful space and of steirischer Herbst, as a conversation between Ekaterina Degot and Vít Havranek. Vít Havranek, who is the artistic director of the Matter of Art Biennial in Prague, and who published this book, The Biennial Reader, as the first reader of this biennial in 2020. Vít Havranek, who is also part of a network of biennials, and it's a network of biennials that consists of the Biennale in Budapest, the Kiev Biennial, and the Prague Biennial, and actually a network in which contexts that call themselves biennials, I would say, in order to act, in order to be able to do something, in order to find an agency, would collaborate, would work together under this title of biennial. So it would have been really interesting to bring together this discourse with questions that Ekaterina Degot brought to Graz in a very long history of a place of debates and interventions and intellectual, artistic and cultural expression. And unfortunately, we cannot do it. It's sad because it would have been a very interesting, specific way that Vít brought us to ask the question about biennials not only as involved in, of course, the tourism industry, involved in neoliberal functionings, involved in some kind of radical chic discourses and amplification of everything we could imagine, but also as tools to act, or as tools to think together in contexts that are either contexts that are silenced in more and more authoritarian political situations. And if we talk about the Kiev Biennial, of course, we know that this is a context that now became a place or a network to organize exile or to organize within a situation of war. So, and of Biennale Budapest, of course, is also a very important, a very important network and place and context of people in Budapest to find ways to express themselves in culture in a certain autonomy from the more and more authoritarian cultural field, or from a cultural field that is more and more organized through authoritarian structures, or structures in which not everything is sayable anymore. So Vít couldn't come because he is sick. This is sad, but I have very good news. A fantastic person came. Someone who has thought about biennials since decades, Oliver Marchart. You agreed to come. We heard from Vít yesterday that he's sick, and today we asked Oliver and he's here, so it's really, really great. And also because all I said here, I owe it in somehow to your thought. Oliver described biennials as hegemony machines. So some people translated this word, Hegemonie-Maschinen, in English into hegemonic machines. But this is actually a wrong translation, because Oliver is not interested only in talking about biennials as means of power. He's also interested in talking about biennials, or let's say, as means of power, which is a bad thing. You are also interested in biennials as means of power to shift the existing power relations. You are actually interested in cultural expressions that would relate to social struggles in order to democratize democracy. This is what you are working on, and this is what you have also been working on in relation to biennials and documenta especially. And another good news, beside the fact that you agreed to come, is that a new book comes out, which is the old book with some additions. And it comes out in English. So Hegemony Machines will be the title. It will be about documenta and about the role of documenta, its involvement in existing hegemonies, but also its ability to shift existing hegemonies. And as your German book that has been influential and important for many people working on biennials, has only been talking about documenta 10, 11, and 12. The English translation of this book has now important additions related to documenta 13, 14, and 15. And I have a lot to say, but I don't want to talk too long, so I really would like to know from you what you think now in 2022 about this idea of biennials and big recurring exhibitions, festivals as hegemony machines.
Yes, thank you, Nora. I think exactly the same as I thought in 28. So, because it's, of course, biennials change as a format, but their function doesn't so much change over that short period of time. So I still think biennials do have that powerful status as hegemony machines, and I explain in a second what I mean by that. And in that sense, they have to be distinguished from the alternative biennials you mentioned in the beginning, which are basically political, artistic, curatorial projects within particular context and historical national situation, where they do not have a powerful apparatus at their disposal. So that's a major difference, because you may call it, in your own words, in Nora's own theory and her own words, that would be para-institutional practices rather than real institutions. So that a biennial could be just a person with a suitcase claiming to be having a traveling biennial. So it's a signifier that can be attached to basically anything. And of course, that signifier capitalizes, and that's why it works, capitalizes on the very symbolic, powerful concept of the biennial. But it is only symbolically powerful because there are so many biennials all over the world, and because it is such a winning formula for maybe the wrong reasons, particularly in local contexts, to found a biennial. And so there is a certain promise attached to that idea of, or to that concept of the biennial. And these para-institutional practices have to be distinguished, I think, as important as they are, from those practices of powerful biennials, which are powerful precisely because of the whole apparatus which is at their disposal. This means, we are sitting here, steirischer Herbst is not exactly a biennial, but say cultural recurring institutions. We are sitting here in a very powerful environment. So it starts with the material resources, the rooms, the buildings at your disposal, the office spaces, and so on. That is something these para-institutional biennials, of course, do not really have. But it comes with a budget as well. It comes with personnel. There are people working for biennials, sometimes many people working for biennials. And it comes with a lot of media and public attention. So these biennials are also a platform, a symbolic and representational platform for presenting something which either feeds into dominant hegemony or basically acts in the sense of counter-hegemonic policies. So if we have a look at the institution of the biennial, we can see immediately that the biennial is something thoroughly political, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a real material sense. And of course, there are other artistic and cultural institutions, museums, art spaces, and so on, which are powerful as well. But the present policy of biennialization, so the spreading of the biennial format, plays directly into political policies in the strict sense of the term. Is that what politicians do, mostly local politicians, and why they want to have a biennial in their city? So, of course, policy and politics here refers foremost to local politics, because biennial and other large events of that nature, for instance, the European Capital of Culture, things like that, contribute to more efficient city marketing. That's obvious. Beyond the economic added value for the area or the city or whatever, however, the policies of nation states also play a role. We can just think, of course, of other formats, but biennialization contributes in no small measure to the construction of national and even continental identity, if we think of the Manifesta, for instance, which is a way of constructing European continental identity. In this context, it has been observed that the format of biennials is directly connected, historically, to that of world exhibitions of the 19th century and early 20th century, which supported the domestic nation building of colonial and industrial nations during that area, the area of imperialism of 19th and early 20th century. So if you think of biennials in that tradition, you may say that this is perhaps not the best format you can choose, because you don't want necessarily to position yourself in the tradition of nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, and so on. Maybe you want. I mean, some may want that, but most of us here in this room, I suppose, wouldn't. Yet there is the possibility of a more progressive functioning of biennials. So-called peripheral biennials, biennials not in the metropolis of the West, but in the South, for instance, the global South, form their own networks and open up channels of communication and translation that can prove valuable locally. They can even become facilitators of political statements or claims. So there is a certain irony that clings to the politics of biennialization, or to biennial politics, if you want to call it like that. Not irony in the humorous sense, I'm afraid, but in a materialist sense. Irony and materialist. It's something like an objective irony, if there is something like an objective irony. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, Western large-scale exhibitions, for the purpose of nation building, brought enormous symbolic, prestigious infrastructural resources into play in the old world exhibitions and then in many early biennials. In a sense, that makes them giant ideology machines, or more precisely, hegemony machines. Machines for the production of the dominant, say, bourgeois, nation-state, Occidental, European culture. Their political significance is enormous. That's one side of the picture. On the other hand, however, and this is the irony, large exhibitions will never succeed in completely controlling the effects they produce. Their institutional apparatus can be made useful for a progressive canon shift in the field. And such shift, and this has been done with already with the world exhibitions of the 19th centuries, where the first international, the workers' movement met on the occasion of these world exhibitions, and so on. So there are always occupations going on of that format. And such an emancipatory shift will make it possible to state certain things that could not be said before. Other things can no longer be said or have to be reformulated hegemonically in order to be said. That does not necessarily occur suddenly, so the loss of hegemony of the dominant culture can happen gradually. So, and here I come to this term hegemony. Hegemony describes an unstable balance between social forces struggling for dominance. And this unstable equilibrium of forces, in which there are always dominant and subordinate forces, is established by institutions, and cultural institutions belong to that network of civil societal institutions. Meaning, no one possesses hegemony. No particular social force, no class, whatever, possesses hegemony. Everyone has to struggle constantly for dominance. In fact, hegemony can never be achieved completely, since there are always other forces that want to get involved. And Antonio Gramsci, who developed that concept of hegemony, proposed therefore the metaphor of a war of position, like the trench warfare of the First World War, for this constitutively tangled situation. So, hegemony is an objectively ironic enterprise. Gramsci's materialism is an ironic materialism. The irony lies in the fact that one's own institutions, one's own institutional fortifications in that war of position can end up in enemy hands as soon as the forces shifts. Think of the trench warfare where people were, it's just a metaphor, the different army, so where maybe a constant shifting form of these system of trenches, it was not one front line between two opposing armies. So that's the image Gramsci has in his mind. So forces and then they can help the enemy these fortifications institutions can fall into that they can establish her own, to put it in not neutral, and possess light about they always spread ideology, not a formalism of the World Exhibition, the ideology nationalism. So the quality of using them for different purposes. And I think this has happened with in the biennial field with some progressive effects. And I want to give you just the example of the documenta and the history of documenta, because this is what I've been working on. So, and you stop me when it gets too long, but I will keep this shorter. So, there was definitely something like an anti-hegemonic shift, with starting with a, say, Documenta 10, that is the Documenta curated by Catherine David. And that definitely was, again, very obvious with Documenta 11, curated by Okwe and Vesor. And where does this hegemonic shift occur? So what exactly did they do with this apparatus, with this very powerful apparatus at their disposal? So my claim is that Documenta 10 and 11 took a canon shift already present in the field, in the art field, and condensed it symbolically into a break with the past in the art field. And there were a number of shifts. They can be traced along several fault lines. I will limit myself to mentioning one shift, which is a particular radical strategy of exhibiting in the form of decentering of the West. So decentering the West is this one shift. But there are other shifts. A politicization of exhibition making. So there are more and more political works exhibited, but also the idea of exhibition making is politicized. A theorization in the approach. So theory and discourse plays a much larger role. You can see that in Documenta 10 with Catherine David, where where she had this 100 days, 100 guests discursive program was unthinkable before. A shift towards education. So since Documenta 10, this is a very important part of all Documenta shows. It's always the education department plays a very, very important role. And then what you also see is an interesting development with some backlashes, of course, like in all these cases, but an interesting development towards collective curatorship. So it's not anymore this idea of the huge individual genius curator like Harald Seemann or somebody like that, but it's clear that a show of that proportions, such a huge, show, can only be curated collectively. Whether you do this openly or secretly by hiding your collaborators somewhere and you're in the front line, or whether it's openly, you have a curatorial collective like what Okwi Invasor established with his co-curators. Up to now with Ruan Grupa as a collective, you can also, of course, see it openly. So just a few words about this shift I wanted to focus on in somewhat more detail about decentering the West. So Documenta 11 in particular, not so much Documenta 10, which is a retro, those of you who have investigated into the history of Documenta, it is a retrospective illusion that Documenta 10, Catherine David's Documenta, was already a post-colonial Documenta, because it is not really, it doesn't figure in the invitation list of the artists. It's only in the discursive program where it was post-colonial. With Documenta 11, with Okwi and Vesor, non-Western art moved to the center of the art field and decentered institutionally Kassel as an event venue. So Vesor advocated something which later curators of Documenta then took up. He advocated the decasselizing of Kassel, if you wish. So it's really a decentering of, of the platform, the exhibition platform, locally in Kassel. So Documenta 11 developed a platform structure and began long before the summer of 2002 and far from Kassel. It started in March and April 2001 in Vienna with the first platform, Democracy Unrealized, which continues in Berlin. Then there was a second platform in New Delhi titled Experiments with Truth, a third platform in St. Lucia on questions of creolité and creolization, and a fourth platform in Lagos on the topic of urban and social problems in African megacities. And only the fifth and final platform was the actual exhibition. And in the philosophy of Documenta 11, all these platforms were on equal footing. So there was no hierarchy in the theory, in the philosophy. There was no hierarchy between these platforms. Of course, most media attention went, of course, to the exhibition. But in the philosophy, that is the curatorial philosophy of Documenta 11, there was no hierarchy. So using this strategy, Vesor was able to decenter Documenta not only in terms of content by bringing in non-Western art, non-Western artists, but also in terms of geography and of time. And that the crucial break with in exhibition making on that axis, on that fault line of of the post-colonial began with Documenta 11. Of course, I mean, there was interest in non-Western art before in the art field, mostly with all these pitfalls of Orientalism, exoticism, or a new primitivism that had begun to increase at the very latest by the time of the Magicien de la Terre exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in 1989, curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, which was 13 years prior to Documenta 11. But it did not mark a break in the art field because the break was when peripheral biennials in Havana, in Dakar, in Johannesburg, in Istanbul, you know, started to bloom and play their part in decentering the Western art system. So Documenta 11 took a canon shift that was already underway at the margins of the field, which is still a Western-dominated field, and moved it precisely to the imaginary center of the Western art world. And here is the difference to previous strategies in the West to include non-Western art, for instance, the Magicien de la Terre exhibition. The difference is that for Invasor, every kind of othering, of exoticizing non-Western art was a total no-go. So Invasor's claim was that most of the so-called non-Western artists, in fact, live in New York or live in Western metropolises. So not all of them, of course, but many of them. So he was really very allergic against this idea that, which is more a decolonial rather than a post-colonial idea. So we see that things shifted over time. He was still a post-colonial theorist and curator. He was very allergic to the idea of attacking the West from a decolonial perspective and claiming that there is something indigenous which is untouched from Western influence or Western coloniality and which has to be now freed from all influences of the West. This is something which, from a post-colonial perspective, is very hard to claim because the West and the West always intermingles, always is already. So the non-West, to a large degree, westernized. And I think the art field is to see this because the very idea of art, you know, of the Western idea of art, which is of course dominant in the art field, is so much Western, and even non-Western art today, when you see it at the art market, and it's of course increasingly there in the platforms of exhibitions and biennials, plays along the lines of that game. It becomes, in a certain way, Western art by being exhibited in these areas, on these platforms. So. Documenta 11 wanted to escape the traps of a new primitivism. And therefore, I think a very clever strategy was to bring in many works of international conceptualism in order to escape this trap. So he brought together Hanne Darboven or Bent Antilla Becher or Maria Eichhorn in a constellation with Latin American political conceptual art, like Luis Kamnitzer, Artur Barrio, for instance, and the works of African artists like Frédéric Brully-Bouabré, who Invasor labeled only partially successfully, as African conceptualism. And the idea behind it was, of course, to escape the racist cliché that art elsewhere was less conceptual, was more emotional, for instance, whatever. And so the West is rational and conceptual, and you know, Africa is emotional and people dance and so on, but they are not conceptual. So this was a real no-go for Invasor. So he brought together Western conceptualism with conceptual practices from other global areas. So when we go through the history of Documenta, and I come to an end in a second, then we see that the strategy of the decasselization of Kassel went on, not with Documenta 12, but certainly with Documenta 13, where Caroline Christoph Bakachiev went to Kabul and to Alexandria. And this outpost in Kabul, even though it was not particularly big, was again thought of as an integral part of Documenta. So there were artists which were present in Kassel, also exhibited in Kabul. And if you think of Adam Szymczyk's strategy of splitting Documenta in half and creating a chiasm, so an exchange where one part takes place on the other side and this side takes place on that side, between Kassel and Athens, you see that this is the same, probably different motivation at the time of the debt crisis and the difficult relation between Germany and Greece at that time. But the strategy is the same. It's a strategy of decentering the West. And now this moved to its apogee with Ruangrupa and Documenta 15, where Documenta isn't anymore a Western or a German show or anything like this, but consists mainly, when you think of the contributions, of collectives, of a network of collectives from all over the globe. So this is an entirely different paradigm, and we will see where it will lead to anyway. But, and here I come to an end, it is basically very emblematic for the political and global situation in which we are today, which is of course not anymore the situation of 2002 and of Documenta 11. Maybe it's something completely different, but it stands in that tradition of a decentering of the West.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for giving us this insight and also some kind of context. And you end with a paradigm shift. You end with an opening to something. We don't know what will happen at Documenta, but it seems that today we can imagine that biennials and festivals have a different function than they had before. We can discuss later if we call it para-institutional or institutional, or in what way hegemonic or hegemony machine in another sense. But this was exactly the question that Ekaterina Degot was interested in when we discussed what we could do together. You said, if you're interested in something, also as someone who is directing a festival here, then this question, what can be done, what is the function of biennials and festivals today?
I don't remember saying that because I'm actually interested in everything. That's my problem. So I was like extremely interested in what Oliver said. There were many, many things and many thoughts. First of all, something about steirischer Herbst, which is important. Steirischer Herbst is not a biennial, not because it's happening every year and not every 2 years. It's not the difference. The difference is that most of the biennials, which we know, this neoliberal institution of a biennial, is where curators are doing it only once. So they are usually almost always someone not from there, who are coming from outside. Sometimes, like when we did this Bergen assembly, we were not even able to stay there because it's so expensive. So we were like flying in only from time to time. So this is being criticized, or some people even support that this is a good idea, but this is this. So we are rather an institution. So I live here. For 5 years already have been living here, my team as well, so my co-curators as well, so mostly. So we are an institution that still is doing every year a festival that as if we would have been a Documenta, but who is doing a program every year and not after 5 years. And also about this palace, it's also important. So you say it's symbol of power. I wonder if that works as a symbol of power in the field of contemporary art. I would say no, because I don't know other biennials they would look like that. So that is actually this particular palace, and it also tells us something. It's rather an outcast, it's a leftover, because it was built by its owner in 18th century, and this is why it has this strange architecture with lots of stairs, and this is why you cannot build a lift there, an elevator, and this is why it cannot be converted into a museum, at least for now. And we are sharing it with other festivals and institutions. So we're happy to have that. But it's not what the usual biennials and biennials offices looks like. So they're rather in that like global style we usually recognize. It's actually difficult to do, and this is, I like this tension, but it's difficult to do a festival of contemporary art in that aesthetical surrounding. And I don't not just mean the office, but the city in general. So there is some sort of rejection, which I think was the energy of steirischer Herbst from the very beginning. And there is this tension. Then just a couple of words about how you described the anti-hegemonic, changes that are happening. I love all of it. I work in that, in decentering, politicization, theorization. This is precisely what we are doing. Everything is, we are trying to find the political meaning. We're doing lots of theoretical talks, but I have also lots of kind of criticism to those positions. Theorization, which I see in other biennials, of course, the art world is very much split into different fields. There are also museums that they have their own agenda. There is also still the profit section, but okay, we're talking about biennials. And biennials, they are somehow oscillating between like big institutions, like, I don't know, a Venice biennial, let's say, or a Documenta, or smaller. There is also a very big field of small, non-profit, non-collecting institutions that are probably most typical for contemporary art world, like everywhere, at least in Europe. And biennials or festivals like ours, they are kind of oscillating between them. So what can I say about those, positions? So theorization of the approach, which is obviously there, so we can even say so in many institutions and many even biennials, some of you mentioned, any art is actually just the pretext for theoretical discussion. Actually, so there are many biennials of that kind where everything is mostly about theoretical and philosophical discussion and art itself is not really relevant. I'm all for that, very much for a discussion at any moment, but that also means that we are escaping audiences. We are escaping so-called broad audiences, and we are basically despising of anyone who doesn't have a PhD in cultural studies. So this is where art is becoming an argument, it's in the theory of meritocracy. So contemporary art, so do we say that? Are we saying that? Are we not saying that? We're kind of implying that contemporary art is for better people, and they are better because they understand it, and they are better because they read Adorno or, I don't know, Bruno Latour, whomever they are supposed to read. So this is one aspect. Politicization, what do I have? But maybe first decentering, briefly. Decentering, it's an interesting notion because it's not really clear what that means. For me, decastleization actually does not mean decentering, because previously, we were rather speaking about some sort of delocalization, like this is how actually Documenta was founded and steirischer Herbst as well. So you are in Kassel in the 50s, you are in the middle of nowhere, at the border with the East, but you are imagining that you are in the better world, in this global, modernity. Same thing with steirischer Herbst in 68 when it was founded. So you are rather you're canceling Kassel, so to speak, and you are thinking that you are somewhere else. So this centering works a little bit differently. It's rather localization than delocalization. So from contemporary point of view, and I'm waiting when it actually happens, someone should say, no, Documenta should be about Kassel. It should be about, because this is actually one of the arguments which I hear all the time here in Graz. So local is better. I have many things against the local because there are lots of aspects of the local and lots of phenomena of the local that are extremely reactionary. But it's difficult to say that. So the local is it's not innocent. But the logic of contemporary, even everything is moralized now, so the local is also supposed to be decolonized even as a metaphor, from the influence of the center, so to speak. So we have to valorize Kassel. Maybe it will be like next Documenta. And the last thing is politicization. Also good thing. I'm also for it. But the current reading of politicization is problematic to me. So current idea of politicization is only reads as a statement, and it's basically anti-critical. So something political, usually people are asking, what do you want to say? So what is the statement here? So that denying something or criticizing something, it's much more difficult to explain. Actually, I would not know how to show contemporary students, let's say, some paintings of Soviet soc-art painters of the 70s. I would not be able to explain why painting a portrait of Brezhnev is a critical gesture or some sort of ironical gesture. I'm not sure that I would be able to explain it to contemporary young people, because everything is understood. We are all thinking, especially the left, actually, in an identitarian way, a very essentialist way. So we are what we are. I'm actually very glad I'm not speaking here as a Russian, because this is what actually I'm constantly asked, not just now. So we are supposed to be all, to be what we are, to express it, and to take a distance from it, to take a distance from anything. It's much more difficult to explain. Also, the last thing is the moralization, which happens more and more, whom you are inviting as an artist or as a speaker, it has to represent your moral choice. It's, as a curator, I'm really defending the right to exhibit artists of especially in historical shows, with different positions, and that of course helps if it happened long ago. But I'm not sure that even in historical shows it can be accepted. It's accepted much more difficultly. So everything became much more direct. And then, I don't know if I answered your question, but this is something I have been thinking recently about biennials a lot.
Okay, so it sounds like, it sounds like you propose that the function of a biennial could be to persist and insist with a critical approach.
Yes, that I would love it to be, but again, there are different biennials, as we already discovered, with different structures, different types of curating. But yes, critical approach, that would be something I would try to, keep.
Now, I feel in myself a lot of critical approach fire burning after what has been said. I am not sure what is my role, because I'm at the same time a moderator and someone with a position.
Whatever you want.
I can define my role, so I will kind of relate to what you have said and then give the word to Oliver to relate as well. And I will do it just in the same way as you, with some doubts. So my first doubt relates to this space. Actually, you said it's a historical leftover. And if we think about the role of biennials since the 50s, the function of the historical leftover is huge. So just quickly to the history of biennials. First, of course, we know is Venice, 1895, and then for a long time, no biennial. And then we see in the 1950s, exactly as you said, some biennials come up in a very concrete context of the Cold War that starts, in the West so-called Cold War that starts. We see biennials coming up in Brazil, Sao Paulo biennial, and in Kassel, and in other places like Alexandria. So we can see that they come up in a very specific moment where there is a certain interest of transnational transnational meeting point also, transnational discourses, meeting points, and so on, for some parts of the world to relate and to meet. But then, of course, and this will, then of course they have another function as well, and especially, I guess, in Brazil, you are totally right. It's the beginning of a new modernism that is invented in collaboration with the US. A new concretism, modernism, new buildings, new architecture, and so on. But in Kassel, it's in a historical museum building that this Documenta starts. It's in the Fridericianum, and in a building that is in ruins at that moment. I will come to that a bit later, because I want to talk about the history of Documenta. I feel the urge. But if we look at it more closely, if I think about my visits of the Manifesta, for example, in Palermo, I have seen many, many palais in which you could have seen, they have all been the places where contemporary art has been shown. Even if I think about Istanbul Biennial, the venues of Istanbul Biennial in many moments were places to somehow investigate the history of the buildings.
But not the office. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think the historical leftover has a specific function in the valorization of the biennial. And I guess this has something to do with the valorization of city space that is deeply related to biennials. And now I don't, so this might not be the exact difference between steirischer herbst and biennials, but many things you said, of course, you are completely right. I mean, somehow it's wonderful to see one person doing it several times, proposing something. And I very much like your positioning that is at the same time different to what how biennials position themselves, but bringing yourself in the context as well, so that we can discuss it and at the same time use it as a para-institutional biennial, but also as a historical festival that has also its strength in relation to that. Because as you said, it's born in 68 and not, now I come to my critique of the history of Documenta, in 1955 in Germany. Because what happened then? We know now that Kassel in the 50s was actually, if you want to call it a place to imagine a better world, it's a nice thing, because most probably it was a washing machine for Nazi biographies, because many of the people who organized the first Documenta we know now have been in the NSDAP. And, yeah, and especially Werner Haftmann, who even was a war criminal, who tortured partisans, and who had a huge role in defining what modern art would mean. And this guy actually said, I couldn't invite Jews to Documenta because they were not modern. So just the better world that has been imagined in Kassel in 1955 was a better world without Jews. And the only Jew he invited was actually Chagall. I mean, Graskamp said he says he's the only Jew, some others says. I mean, we don't ask for the Aryan pass. But Marc Chagall, of course, was not modern in this sense. You know, it was a painted rabbi by Marc Chagall.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something I just wanted to say also so if someone would say Documenta should be about Kassel, I guess it should be, then Documenta should be about how Nazi biographies have been art-washed, what is the role of this institution in relation to that, and why in the year when all this has been coming out publicly through the research of many people, but mostly also through an exhibition by the Deutsches Historisches Museum that has been shown in Berlin in this year, like in the last year. Why is this not a big topic that we discuss now?
The most popular exhibition of the year, actually.
I think so. And now we have a discussion about Documenta, but how can we relate to it? Yeah. For me, if we talk about the local, the interlocal, as Juan Gruppa says, is there a possibility to relate to this very specific historicity, or is it not important? And if it is not important, what does it mean about the decasselization of Kassel? So this would be my questions in relation to history and the decentrary. And I guess I stop here, and I give the word to Oliver.
Okay. Well. Well, picking up on some things that have been said, I would agree with a couple of points. So there is certainly a trend towards moralization, or a mixing up politicization with moralization, with identity politics, and so on, which sometimes also with very with a sort of art which is just a statement of well-meaning intentions rather than really an analytical a contribution to a better understanding of the political topic, which is at the center of the piece. We can go on with criticism of that, endlessly. One would need at some point to talk about concrete cases. Anyway, I think that the problematic is somewhat more complex, because also more complex that I presented it, because politicization is something which has become of value at the very same time at which it was initially meant as a critical engagement, or bringing in critical topics to different spheres of representation to the art field. And then it becomes what Bourdieu would have called a symbolic capital of artists. And there is a whole genre, if you wish, or a whole demand for seemingly politically engaged art, which is only on the surface really political, very superficially political. But neither the political stance of the artist nor the analytical added value of the piece really make it political in a reasonable sense, So it's like a genreification, and that's the critique of the genreification of the political genreification of art goes back to the 1980s. I mean, there was a Whitney biennial, which was for the first time called the politically correct biennial, which has been criticized. So this goes back to the 1980s. And now it is like state of the art in many biennials, not all biennials, to be sure, to include that. And it is, and as I said, I mean, when we think about hegemony, then it is always a war of position. It is always a very complex terrain of forces. And to occupy a particular space of representation with, for instance, particular political topics is, on the one hand, a sign of a victory, because you get public attention, you put it on the table. And on the other hand, of course, there is always the danger of what the Italians call gatopardismo, or what is a transformation or an appropriation of a political position, an absorption into the dominant hegemony. Because everyone looks for it. Oh, we have a political artist. Please come here, present your work. It's very interesting. No effect whatsoever, because it is already seen as something which is desirable within the art field.
Why do they call it gatopardismo?
They call it because of il it's because of this novel. The Italians say gatopardismo. Because the guy in the novel says, in order for things to stay the same, we need to change it, right? This is the classical formula of conservatism, of modern conservatism. It's not like keeping things as they are, but because it's impossible to keep them as they are. So we need to change a bit so they stay the same,
Think about the Visconti movie, if you don't know yet, but it's Der Leopard, Il Gattopardo, that came out as a Visconti movie as well.
But it's very neoliberal.
Absolutely,
That's his
yes. Yes. Absolutely, and that happens with political art, so and with many other things, but not necessarily. And at the same time, you see a shift in discourse. Things can today, if we think of the achievements of feminism and so on, today certain things cannot be said, at least in certain environments, that were very easily sayable 20, 30, 40 years ago. So things shift, but they shift very slowly. And so then the question of the delocalization, I found this particularly interesting. It says, you point out the dialectics, that the decentralization is at the same time a relocalization. So delocalization and relocalization go hand in hand, which is of course true. But I think when we see Ruan Grupa's practice today, then you're right, or Nora also is right, that it is a translocalism. it's a connection of localisms. It's not anymore the decentering as like an offensive strategy, as it was the case with Okrien Wesor's Documente 11, but it is beyond that, as it were. And I think that the shift, the change, which is not a shift in the art field, which is a historical shift, is that the West has been effectively decentralized. Not in every respect and so on, but when you think of this famous book by Dipesh Chakrabarty, Provincializing Europe, then today, I mean, when it was published, you could say, oh yeah, that's a very important thing to provincialize Europe. Today, I think Europe is provincial.
Provincial enough.
Provincial enough, especially the European Union, is provincial enough. Of course, they also have, colonial and imperialist fantasies, but Europe has been put in its place in the global power, centers shifted, and now I think the Ruangrupa strategy is much more productive because it doesn't focus on the enemy so much. So it doesn't have this imaginary image of Europe as the center of the world, which is only the European image of itself, but it simply doesn't care about that at all, And so I think this is a sign, this is a symptom of a much larger change in global affairs, if you wish. And then the same thing with Kassel as the imaginary center of the art world, which is only the imaginary center of the art world, of the global art world in Germany. So, of course, it is an important exhibition, still, always has been, but it is hugely overrated within Germany. At the very same time, of course, you can say, okay, what is not overrated from like the local, perspective? And I would say that the pure size, the amount of resources, the number of artists that goes into that is so enormous that it still is a very symbolically and infrastructurally powerful platform. And my point is, which is a bit directed against the discourse of new institutionalism of the early 2000s, where everything was about, okay, we need to take over our, more or less local art institutions and make them more democratical and change many things infrastructurally, which was very important at that point. But then you forget about the resources in your hand that come with this institution, which are, and I always have the, maybe I don't need to tell you, but I always have the impression that many people who run art institutions and cultural institutions, because they're so much involved in the daily affairs and their own struggles with the city government or whatever, lose the sense of the importance and the power invested in what they have in their hands, in the institutions, the resources, the money, the manpower, and also the public attention they can register. So this is enormous, much more than a university. I'm working at a university. Nobody cares about universities, but everyone has an idea, some opinion about cultural institutions, be it the Burgtheater or local festivals or whatever. So I think I stop here.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot here on the panel. It's 8:11, and 8:30 we should think about an end. So we have 20 minutes left for possible questions, discussions. Maybe the fire of critique is burning in you as well. Please come up with thoughts, discussions, even statements. They can even be moralistic, but they can also be critical. Yeah.
They can also be theoretical.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for all your positions, and there's a lot of fire, so yeah, I feel very inspired. I wanted to ask you, Oliver, how do you see the relation between biennials and the art market? Because especially if you kind of, you know, as I understand, like identify the platform of biennials as something powerful, I'm just curious, how do you see them, these structures, in relation to a bit of a larger structure that we're in as well?
Please, yes, of course.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that also some sort of genreification happened here. You speak of biennial art, which is considered to be more edgy, more political, and so on, than art, but at the same time, or gallery art, but at the same time, of course, it has not only its audience, it also, as a rule, there are galleries, there is a certain sub-market for this kind of art. When it comes to biennials, of course, it's always different. In the case of the documenta, also you have different strategies. In the Christoph Bakachiev documenta, for instance, was a huge economic enterprise. I'm quite critical of that edition, actually, where the galleries, hand in hand with Documenta GmbH, and other funding bodies, whoever wanted to give money, banks, whatever, produced these artworks that were there. So it was from the beginning already fed into the art market. So whatever you saw there was already, you know, gallery art, you know, even if you wouldn't expect it from at the face of it. Now we have a completely different documenta coming up, where obviously, I mean, I haven't seen it, nobody has, but what you can tell from what we know about it, this doesn't play any role at all. So it may be not with all these collectives, I would suppose. Also, the function of Documenta as a career maker for artists is, I would say, somewhat overrated. Some artists have the same problem as the Documenta curators. Documenta curators have have the problem of finding, you know, a job afterwards, as a rule, you know. So it's not that their career, you know, takes off, you know, after Documenta. And some artists who happen to have no gallery before may find one, but not necessarily the best one, and so on. So I think it's slightly overrated. It has something to do with, very much like in other cases of the cultural field, of the art field, it is something like self-hypnosis, or, you know, a form of self-delusion to think of how important that is as a career step to be in the Documenta. This has become something like a myth, which you know, as much as I can tell, there are enough people who were artists who were presented at Documenta and didn't make a career afterwards. So, yeah.
I would like to add something very quickly in relation to the upcoming Documenta, because I think it's interesting. Of course, maybe just quickly first, of course, economy and Documenta is deeply related, and the most part of the economical relation to Documenta is city economies. I mean, there's, of course, the city is called Documenta Stadt Kassel, even though Documenta happens only 100 days every 5 years. And then we might think many more things about that, but what is important for it to function, and this is what I can relate to what you said, Oliver, is that actually Documenta plays the game of economy not being a major driver of it. It only functions because it plays the game of not talking too much about it. Adam Cimcik made it already a topic in relation to Athens, of course, and already played with economy by bringing the concept of Documenta as a common in. But with Ruan Grupper now, the creation of alternative economies is clearly one of the main parts of what they are doing. And I think this is actually interesting, that they integrate in a logic of hidden, economy is hidden but huge. Another logic, which is economy, working on alternative economies is actually what we want to do. Yeah.
Can I just add a sentence? Because the key Ruan-Krupa strategy is about the sharing of resources. So that's what you meant about the commons. And the sharing of resources also among the different collectives which are invited, which are grouped together. So they need to, among themselves, need to share resources. And of course, it's a trickster strategy because they are the resources. So they wouldn't have a problem with a bank giving money. You know, the resources, whatever goes into that is good because it will then be redistributed among those who need it, you know, for their also local political and social and cultural practices. So the whole thing is a huge exercise in the sharing of resources. So a different economy, a different idea of economy, which is, I would say, a non-capitalist idea of economy, which bypasses the art market, but not by ignoring or fighting the art market, but maybe capitalizing on the art market if it comes in handy and you can use it, you grab what you get and you redistribute it. And I think that's an entirely different strategy, it sees Documenta as precisely what I, repeatedly said it is. It is, a bundle of resources.
Machine.
It is a hegemony machine. It consists of a lot of resources, and they don't get into Documenta because they say, well, we are now artistic directors of Documenta. This will shift or change our life and will make our career, They go into this with the idea of, well, there are a lot of resources involved here. Let's take them and do something with it, and redistribute them.
Okay, more questions, thoughts, remarks. Yeah. Andrea.
So thank you very much to all of you to this very inspiring talk. I found particularly interesting, not so interesting, but not discussed much, I think, the topic of art washing, which happens with all these biennials. That means going away from economy to political, to politics, and to political on one hand. And I think it would be very, important maybe like to outline, even if you look at Europe, a lot of like these biennials happened after wars or were organized to try to mendel a critical political situation or something, like Documenta, of course, after Second World War in Germany, and Manifesta after Yugoslavian war, after Srebrenica, when it kind of starts. So this is, for example, maybe or what also Ekaterina said, steirischer herbst, also very much connected to some very conflicted political positions. So this is something maybe, it's not a question, it's maybe a comment or also a question, maybe also Nora or Oliver can comment this in general. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, and but again, I think it's not, the answer to it is not that clear. I think that one example could be also Johannesburg. The first Johannesburg Biennial that was right after the boycott and organized by many white people and the main white artistic director, and then the second one where Okwi Nvezo was the artistic director, but that couldn't come to an end. And Okwi related Johannesburg Biennial actually to Documenta. And I listened when I was working on my podcast about biennials. I was listening to people who were interviewed for the first Johannesburg Biennial, and you could see that the white people involved said finally the end of the boycott, and the black people involved said finally the end of apartheid. Apartheid. So this difference, I think, is so crucial, and I think it's similar with Documenta. Most of the people in 1955 said, Documenta is great, finally the end of the boycott, in somehow. They did not say finally the end of fascism. And this is how they understood this new German modernism, because it was actually an invention of German modernism. Yeah, to look at it closely, I think, is very important. And at the same time, of course, it was also a promise, it was a possibility. If we look at Haus der Kultur in the Welt, it was also amazing what could have been done with this, in the West, so-called Cold War money. And we should, I think we should look at it, and I like to, I mean, in the contrary, we discussed this at our symposium, you know, in the contrary to a demodern approach, I like to look at anti-colonial modernisms. I like to look at Dakar, I like to look at Yugoslavia as imaginations of another possibility of modernity that also came with these exhibitions. So historically, there are some who have clearly this function of art washing, and then there are some that have clearly this function of using national, because this is also important. You said, you know, the big exhibition, the world exhibition, is not per se a national thing, or it could also be the idea of the exhibition of the biennial in the third world has been used as the flag has been used, as an anti-colonial thing, as the invention of another possible nation. And in this sense, even here, I would not like to look at it from a moralistic perspective, from the perspective of a moralistic statement, but more from the question of hegemony machine, from the question of what is possible, how can it be shifted. And just a last thought about it, I very much agree with you about this what I call them simulacrum conflicts that reduce every possibility of a political conflict into a moralistic statement that comes with a lot of resentment most of the time. And I see this resentful moralism very much as part of these washing strategies, because we don't, most of the time when we know what is good and what is bad, we actually don't ask about the economies.
Maybe I say something.
Yeah.
Briefly. You know, Andrea, thank you for this question, because it's very complex. Okay, so I'm listening to this like hegemony of biennials. Documenta has power, true. But what is it, like, I'm sorry to say, what is at stake in this Western world with this power? Not much. Although, like, when I lived in Russia, and it was right till 2014 when Manifesto in Petersburg actually took place, in the year when Crimea was annexed.
Exactly.
Before that,
Exactly.
You cannot imagine how many times I actually used this power and this hegemony of Documenta to say some reactionary apparatchiks or museum directors, you know, I was saying, you know what, this is how it is done at Documenta. I said, okay. Okay, so that helped me a lot. But then Manifesto Petersburg, happening in the middle of this situation, you know, not to use bad words, when Crimea is annexed. And I see now, I look at it with such sadness now, because there were some great works there. It was full of hopes that indeed, is it art washing? It was also full of, so it's not like, Andrea, when you're saying that it happens after the war. Sometimes it happens before the war. It's actually worse. So that was the manifesto that was happening before the war, which is happening now, which was already on the way. Yeah. And it was art washing, but at the same time, the locals were full of hope that bringing our great artists like Thomas Hirschhorn with his best work ever there would change things for the best, but it did not. And so which role did it play? So now then it's become the question of power and hegemony becoming really kind of central to huge problems.
Yeah. Similar with Istanbul Biennial. That was about public space in the year of Gezi, when Gezi was silenced, in the same year. So it's, yeah, sometimes it happens in the very middle of an authoritarian transformation process or a war.
I mean, but at the same time, the obviously powerful role of art institutions and cultural institutions is attested or proven or whatever by the fact that even an authoritarian regime, or a regime authoritarianizing itself, like Orban or Putin or whoever, is very careful in, taking out the progressive directors and putting their own cronies into this place and revamping the whole structure and using these hegemony machines for their own purposes. Like in Poland now, yeah. Yeah, like in Poland, yeah. So they know what they do. So sometimes against this, it's Antonio Gramsci hegemony theory. Sometimes the critique of Gramsci is, but this can be, hegemony theory is wrong because this can also be done by the right. Not only the left can use that theory, because there are cases where rightists used hegemony theory. Yeah, that's precisely the reason why it is correct as a theory, because because it gives you basically the explanation and the tools to achieve consent and consensus in a society via this civil society cultural institutions. And therefore, everyone tries to get these institutions into their hands. And even now, I mean, the liberal democratic regimes we live in Austria and other Western European countries, also do this. Of course, I mean, these are liberal institutions, and criticality and political art, as long as it doesn't hurt too much, is, part of the game of this liberal democracy. And so this is, I mean, it's preferable to authoritarian, would not deny this, but it is also part of a liberal democratic hegemony. So every regime does that. And but at the same time, these institutions very often pretend that this is not the case, that they are neutral. They are neutral vessels for beautiful art or whatever, which is never the case. Even if they only show beautiful art, they are not neutral.
Thank you. You gave us a clear position. I mean, with everything you said, you gave us a clear position of the function of Biennials and Festivals today. They are embattled terrains for hegemony and counter-hegemony. And I have this method to A, finish a discussion, and B, democratize the final words. So because we are at the end of our discussion now, and what I propose is that everybody who has still a remark and a statement or a question that will remain open, just raise their hands now. One. Anyone else? No one else? Are you sure? There will be no chance afterwards. No one else? Okay, so then please, the final word is yours.
Yeah, sorry for taking two questions, but yeah, I have one comment that I I'm really curious about. If one disidentifies with power, is it possible to then still change the power structures? Because what I see, maybe Documenta is not the base case study for that, but what I see with a lot of biennials is that they actually very strongly identify with the powerless, with the disempowered, with the queer, with the minority and so on, and then they kind of... The powerlessness, that there is much more identification. Yes, it's Eva Majewska. Not only, but yes, but among others. And I'm wondering, if one, consciously, also as a biennial structure, disidentifies with the power structures, is it still possible to change them?
I think that it will be very powerful to keep this as the final word. Thank you very much.